Welcome to all the colleagues who have joined us for the second part of this afternoon. And now I'm very pleased to welcome our second keynote of the day, Susan McKinney. She is professor at the Faculty of Behavioral Management and Social Sciences at the University of Twente. And she's especially interested in exploring and supporting the interplay between curriculum development and teacher professional development. Her past work has emphasized the supportive role of technology in curriculum and teacher development. In more recent work, she's been looking at the issues in the fields of science education and early childhood literacy. Thank you to be here, Susan.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, not just to engage in these wonderful ideas, which has been a pleasure for the last couple of days, but I don't think I've ever been at a university campus with a better view. It's wonderful. I think it must be very inspiring to be here on a regular basis. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my background so you understand the perspectives that I bring to the next 30 minutes, plus some dialogue, I hope. I'm a mother of 3 children. I'm a 4th-generation teacher in my family who really enjoyed the rigor of academia and stayed at the university level. And now I co-lead the teacher education program at my university, which is a technical university. So we do educate teachers of economics and social studies, but we really educate a lot of chemistry and physics and computer science and math teachers. In the last 25 years or so that I've been doing research, I have been studying ways that we can support designers. It started out in Africa, looking at how we could support designers of curriculum at schools, specifically people who were working to create tools for teachers to use, so looking at how to support curriculum designers. But I've also been looking at how to support the teacher as a designer, whether they're designing analog materials for use in a kindergarten classroom or digital tools for use online in hybrid environments at universities and all kinds of other things. And in more recent years, I've also been looking at ways to support researchers as another genre of designers. And my supposition is that each of you in this room wears at least one of those hats, and maybe a lot of you wear 3 of those hats, all 3 of them at some point in time. But the talk today is really focused on especially supporting the role of teacher, but taking into consideration the work of Daria and thinking about the fact that that's contextualized with a lot of attention for ICT and focus on higher education. So a couple of themes that will come throughout the talk today have to do with a shared interest that I think we all have on looking at resources that can support teachers and the act of teaching. And I'm also especially interested and we'll pay a lot of attention to in the next 30 minutes the idea of the kind of infrastructure that can help teachers in their work. But maybe it helps to just tell you a little bit of an overview of where we want to go more specifically. I'd like to tell you a couple of points of departure that, as a scholar of the field of curriculum, I think are sort of basic. If you don't understand that about me, you won't understand the rest of the things that I want to share with you, and talk a little bit about the kinds of aspects of infrastructure that are important to contribute to teacher learning. And then I'll give some examples from a couple of projects that I've been involved with in the US, in Europe, and also at my own institution, looking at the kinds of things that materials have to embody to be useful, and the ideas behind them that are more and less explicit sometimes, and with some implications for higher education in particular. So when I talk about curriculum materials, I'm talking about all kinds of things. I don't mean just a syllabus or just a textbook. I mean simulations, models, all different kinds of tools that you could use for learners of all different ages. And I think it's helpful to note that there are different kinds of tools, and 2 big baskets that I'll limit it to for now are pedagogical materials, so tools that are really intended for the learners to use, and performance tools, tools that really help the teachers in their job. And they have very different characteristics, which maybe we'll want to talk about later on. But the big distinction, I think, is very helpful, especially because when we look at a lot of online learning environments, they're kind of mashed up. And sometimes it's hard for people to tell what's what. what do I mean by curriculum? Another important point of departure I have learned from this woman. Her name is Miriam Ben-Peretz. She's a professor emeritus now from the University of Haifa, and she has written an amazing book that back in the 1980s, which talks about the idea of curriculum as the way I always saw it when I was teaching. It's a bunch of possibilities. It's potential that we can draw on. And it's not necessarily, whereas a lot of times people look at books and textbooks and things as have-tos, sort of a tunnel or a corset that you get shoved into. And she talks about how important it is for teachers to develop the skills to interpret curriculum materials from different perspectives so that they can see the potential that's right for them based on their goals or the kinds of activities that they embody, or maybe the perspectives that they have with regard to how learners think. But doing that requires this idea of curricular literacy. And in order to be able to look at materials critically through different lenses and harvest from them what's going to work for you and leave behind what's really not relevant, you need to understand very well your subject area, but especially where you're trying to take your learners and how would you know when you get there. And without those two pieces of information, it's very hard to harvest the potential in curriculum materials, and that's often why people end up getting sort of stuck on a railroad, not even understanding their own use. So the quality of curriculum materials is something that's also really important, not just being able to use them well, but having good sources to begin with matters a lot. And I've been studying the kinds of curriculum materials that will engender some really ambitious kinds of teaching, or at least teaching that really works, and so have many other people. And these are some pretty high bars to reach. Not many of us use materials, and I have studied materials that actually meet these standards, and there's like 6 in the world. Okay, maybe it's a little better than that, but there aren't very many that are really rigorously based on this kind of stuff, even though this is what the experts say all materials should be based upon. But we can work in step by step towards some version of this, I think. So in order to make good use of materials and in order to see the role of materials in teacher learning, I think it helps to put it into the bigger perspective of the day-to-day of what teachers actually do. So I'd like to take a minute to talk a little bit about that. Because materials don't live in a vacuum, and even if they live on a server, you know, when people interact with materials, it's part of a much bigger, complex whole. And I'm still going to reduce it to a simplified figure, which isn't going to be good enough, but hopefully it'll show at least the way I would position the use of materials in the bigger day-to-day life of teaching. So we'll look at the core tasks that teachers perform, the knowledge and skills that they need in order to do that, and how teachers actually learn through repeated and deliberate practice, and the fact that it matters very much where that happens and the context around it. So if you've ever taught, you probably know that teachers do 3 main things. They plan lessons. This group of resource teachers that I work with in India planned lessons together because they'd never planned lessons before and they needed help in planning, but very often that's an isolated task. But teachers are designers. Teachers enact lessons, and that's like the core business of teaching for people who are, or at least for people who would consider themselves teachers. This is the thing that they spend most of their time doing, interacting with learners in a classroom. Another thing that we know that teachers and other kinds of professionals do is they think about their action. And while they sometimes design on the fly during enactment, they also sometimes reflect on the fly during enactment. And this guy, Donald Sherm, wrote a beautiful book that talks about the importance of practitioners in all different kinds of professions, including teaching, to be able to reflect in the moment, to try and understand what's going on with a kid or a group, and change on the fly based on those emerging insights. But we also know from a lot of work in teacher professionalization research that when teachers talk together about their own experiences, and if they have good guidance in reflection processes, they can also be really meaningful for their own professional development. So these are the three main things that I would categorize under the broad header of teaching performance. If you want to perform the job of teaching, you got to be able to do these three things, and they overlap to some extent. Like I said, design and reflection happen on the fly, in the moment, just as much as they do outside of the classroom. In order to do that, I've synthesized some ideas from a lot of literature here. And this is basically a list of the kinds of expertise that really good teachers have. They have, fundamentally, they understand their learners. They understand the kinds of questions that they're going to ask, the kinds of conceptions and misconceptions that they're going to bring to a classroom or to a course. And they understand something about how people think, and they're able to leverage natural, like human laws of nature, like being curious and the kinds and people's need to check ideas with others. And preferably, they have also some integrated knowledge of this. There's this guy in my field named Lee Schulman, maybe he's also in your field, I don't know, who's talked a lot about the idea of pedagogical content knowledge, so specific knowledge about ways to teach certain things. And Punya Mishra and Matt Curler have also talked about the idea of technological pedagogical content knowledge, specific knowledge about how to use technologies to teach specific concepts. But those things can only be used in a productive way if there's a fundamental, or if there's enabling understanding of the curriculum, the goals, the assessment, and all the kinds of things that steer where you're going with kids. In addition, we have several different kinds of skills that teachers need in order to do their job well. These are the ones that I think are particularly important. And enacting those kinds of things is certainly colored by the kinds of convictions and beliefs and perceptions that teachers bring to the enterprise. So we have the performance in the classroom. We have the expertise that you carry around in your mind every day. And then we also have the idea that you use your expertise to perform. And when we think about teachers learning, I think it's important to notice that it's the interactions between the expertise that they have as a person and as an individual and the way they use it to perform in practice that leads to teachers' professional growth. And here are a couple of examples of when working in a classroom or in a online course environment, whatever you have, can be informative can teach teachers something that feeds into their enrichment of their expertise. And over here on the left-hand side, there's a couple of examples of how teachers apply expertise in the design, enactment, and reflection on their lessons. Do any of these sound familiar to you? Or they look like familiar things to you? Do you recognize them as teachers? Okay, great, then it's maybe not too crazy. So if we want to pay attention to teacher professional growth, then what we really need to do is focus in on these arrows, is my stance. But all of this doesn't happen in a vacuum, like I said. Your universities, the schools that our kids are in, they're these dynamic, exciting, kind of crazy, and well, at least very interesting environments. And so teachers, not only is their work situated, but their learning is equally situated. And if we don't pay attention to that, then we're not going to be able to provide resources that will foster their own professional learning. And three particular aspects of context have really big influence on the ways that teachers learn or not. And the first one is, of course, the human aspect. So the learners in their classrooms or in their groups, if it's online, those are the ones that give immediate feedback to teachers about how they're doing and when they're confusing and when they're going too fast or when they're going too slow or when they're not showing enough organization for the learners to make sense of what's going on. The colleagues in the environment are sometimes people to just hang out and have coffee with and maybe complain with or who knows what, but there's also typically peers and expertise in the environment that teachers can leverage, at the very least as a help desk, and sometimes to go more beyond that. So there's human aspects of infrastructure, but there's also material aspects of infrastructure, which we've talked a lot about so far today already, especially the digital ones, but there are many other pieces of the material infrastructure, of course. And another piece that I'd pull out as a separate one is the structural. Policies would land heavily into that category. So the boundaries and the conditions in which we must operate for whatever reason. They set opportunities or constraints depending on the way they're formed. So if we think about teachers learning and we think about tools that can maybe facilitate teachers learning, I think that the infrastructure that can help that is going to focus on it's going to have the material and the human and the structural aspects that really help foster the exchange between the expertise and the performance. And so when we think about the kinds of digital materials that online resources might might contain, I think that if we're not paying attention to those things, we're probably not going to help teachers come further in their job of teaching or learning how to teach. So I think that the Daria platform, taken from my, and open resources in general, tend to focus a lot on the material pieces. And I have heard in some of the talks today that there's some attention for also the human aspects. And I think that's really exciting to hear. And then there was like maybe a couple of hints about maybe looking into some of the structural, let's say, university policies and whatnot that could actually help teachers to develop their own expertise and performance. Often through the use of materials. So now what I'd like to do is talk about what makes materials helpful for that growth process, and then give a couple of examples from my own experience about ways that we might think about doing some productive ventures in the future. I have a study that I'm conducting together with some friends at the University of Berkeley in California and also at the University of Pittsburgh. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. And in this study, we are looking at how fabulous designers have managed to create materials that do productive things in classrooms. And one thing we found out pretty early on is that the materials typically contain some of these pieces. They contain supports for students, and they contain lots of supports for teachers. And again, supports in the spirit of Miriam Ben-Peretz, that is to say, potential, not have to. And I can tell you lots more about this project if you're interested, but for now I'm going to focus just on one sub-study in the entire project where we've done a retrospective analysis of all of the science curricula that the US government funded for K through 12 education in a 10-year window of time. That's an awful lot of data. And then we went and looked at all the documentation we could find on outcomes in terms of teachers' growth and pupil, student learning. And we basically ran a couple of different statistical tests to find out which features of materials had the biggest outcomes on student and teacher learning. And I don't know if you can see the bold ones here, but I can summarize them for you here. A couple of things have come out to us as really important, and this is something to think about, I think, especially when we talk about open resources, because they typically are less coordinated. And one of the biggest things that we found is that multiple sequence, so materials that build one upon the other in a way that follows through and has a learning progression and a conceptual build, they matter a lot. Another thing that we found is that the teachers need support for teaching strategies. Maybe less relevant in higher ed, but certainly important for K through 12 teachers is that they're aligned to standards. So if it doesn't fit that thing that the teachers are going to be held accountable to do, probably they weren't going to pay as much attention to it. Teachers really benefit from information about what they can anticipate from their learners. And maybe this is also a little more for primary and secondary school than for higher ed, I don't know. They really benefit from content support. Maybe in higher ed, where you typically have content experts as teachers, that could be different. I don't know. But in our study, these were found to be really important. Another aspect of teaching materials that sometimes, well, actually most of the time, tends to be somewhere in there, like it was part of the designer's gut ideas, but it wasn't always put out there as an explicit thing, is the theory of action. How is the use of the materials going to contribute to teacher learning, or how is the use of these materials going to contribute to student learning, depending on if you're looking at pedagogical materials or performance materials. If we don't explicate our ideas about how materials are actually going to make a productive change. It's very difficult for users to figure out if they're using them in ways that are going to engender that productive change. If you have a theory of action as a designer, it's also usually important to test it. And we've heard some very interesting ideas around the different platforms about how the platforms will grow and how people will come to use them. And I've seen a lot of projects that have the Field of Dreams mentality. I don't know if you know this movie, but it was a long time ago. But one of the lines that comes back over and over again in the movie is, if you build it, they will come. And in this movie, a baseball field was built, and these imaginary baseball players came. But in real life, it doesn't work that way. If you build resources, that doesn't make people flock to them. There has to be a really good understanding of what it is that people want and need, and not only that, because they can give you a Christmas list of what they want. What will it take to get them to engage for real? And under what circumstances are they doing that? Is that at 10 o'clock at night sitting on the couch when they're freaking out because they don't have what they need for the lesson tomorrow? Or is that when they're actually taking time during summer break to reflect, or something else? These things have implications for the way we shape everything from the content to the interface. So I think that we need to think of, when we think about a theory of action, it's important to think about the way that people would realistically be using the resources that we create. It's also important to think about the way that, like we talked about earlier with Daria, how might these things spread? If there's like a critical mass necessary for a resource to be really valuable, how does that happen? I mean, people get excited and laugh when stuff goes viral, but a lot of, and Malcolm Gould has written some interesting, Gladwell has written some interesting stuff about what makes things tip, the tipping point of when things go and take on their own lives. But to a great extent, that has to do with how well they fit like a glove into your life and give you that thing that you need, and don't make your life harder, but make your life easier. Certainly for teachers, that's a really important thing. Teachers are really busy people. Most of the ones that I know, or at least many of them, work second jobs because it doesn't pay very well, and they're being asked more and more to carry out administrative duties. So natural fit with the day-to-day is important. I think that when it comes to online resources, and certainly with the Daria platform, it's interesting because there could be theory of action at two different levels. We could be talking about the theory of action alive within the resources themselves, like how are these resources going to do things in classrooms and in courses. And there's also the theory of action that's embodied by the portals or the workshops or the events like this, through which the materials are assessed. And they're very different, and that's important to think about. So I just gave you one example from my own experience of a project where we set out to explicate our theory of action and work accordingly. It was a European Union funded project with 51 partners. I wouldn't recommend that again, but it was exciting to have 51 partners in over 20 countries. And it was to basically create and launch something called Open Discovery Space. This is an online open platform for educational resources. The basic, we did a lot of things wrong in that project, like really a lot. But one thing that I think was done really well was to think about scale wasn't an afterthought. Scale was a concern from the very get-go. And one of the core assumptions was we need communities to achieve scale. So we start building communities day one. We don't make stuff and ask people later. We work together on the community building, and we're going to need the authority to get it launched. So we're going to start off in each phase. You see leaders, teachers, and policymakers. They were all involved, but the bottom ones are the ones that were like the people who got the biggest injections of ODS-ness. And so we started off really working with the leaders who would help identify champions who could help us get something off the ground and build communities around that. But we also know that charismatic leadership is not sustainable, and we spent most of our time in that blue space working with teachers and listening to what they needed and what they wanted, and trying to create resources that would make their lives easier, which made them tell each other, and that grew the community. And once we had enough that we could say, look, we done good, then we went to the policymakers and said, and now we want this institutionalized because you have the proof of the pudding here. We can see the results. And ODS ended 2 years ago, but the user, there's still events going on, and the user numbers are, well, we're happy with the way it's gone. And like I said, there's a lot of things that we did wrong, but I'm starting with the vision of scale, not as an afterthought, but as something from the beginning, and the participatory approach, I think, is what got us as far as we were able to go. So, I'd like to just mention 3 implications that I think might be interesting to consider for open education resources in higher education, maybe for DARIAH 2.0 if that's on the horizon, I don't know. And they relate to some tensions that we see in teaching in higher ed, and certainly when it comes to the use of resources in teaching in higher ed. So one of the first one is the tension that we have as higher education educators. A lot of people in higher education institutions are teaching because they like their subject area. Certainly where I teach, there are, if you survey the people and say, how many of you people, decided when you grew up you wanted to be a teacher? That's just not it. And for some people, I'm at a research-intensive university, and it's not very nice to say it, but the reality is, for some people, teaching is this extra thing that they have to do. That's the way it feels. And well, I'll talk about the academic reward system in a minute, but we have been working very hard at Twente to begin to value teaching alongside research, and also to help teachers identify that they actually have that professional hat. It's not just this thing that they do, but that they are teachers. And so we try to support their growth as teachers. And we've just started something this year, which I'm hoping will deliver the way we're expecting. Everybody in every Dutch university, if you're at a university for more than 5 years, you have to get something called a teaching qualification. Our government decided you needed that. So even though I'd been teaching for over 20 years at the time, I was a teacher by profession, I still had to do my teaching qualification. But there's a lot of good sides to it, because most people weren't in that boat, right? Most people are subject area experts who get thrown in front of a classroom and really didn't know a whole lot about teaching. So now we have that. That's a nice mill. It's been working for quite some time. And we realized that, well, you can look at it from different ways. If you go from the policy perspective, in the Times higher education ranking, our university is 163, which is not bad. But our research is here and our teaching is here. And that is the lever that many of us were looking for to say to our policymakers, you got to start rewarding teaching if you want to get higher up in the rankings. And that's not the only reason why we started a Center for Engineering Education, but it was great timing when that information came out. And our board of directors has decided that they're going to reward excellent teachers. And we've developed together with our university teaching center, so I'm at the, it doesn't matter where I am. Anyway, we've developed a program for a senior teaching qualification. It's a 1-year, pretty intense program. But as you see here, we try really hard to facilitate these people and to help them begin to see themselves not just as people who enact teaching and get kids through, or students through our program, but as scholars in their field. And because we have the political backing from the university board, we are optimistic that this is something that will take off. And we don't expect every teacher to want to participate in this, but we think it's a very nice model, and sort of inspirational model for some. And definitely if I listen to some of the conversations that were held earlier today, talking about how can you basically get credit for, or how can we show that we are really taking our teaching seriously, this is a model that I think could offer some ideas for that. A second tension is the conversation versus isolation tension. We know from decades of scholarship on teaching and teacher expertise and how that grows that teachers learn from talking and listening, bar none. Like, they can learn from other things, and that's wonderful, but they learn the most from talking and listening with each other. And then we also know that most of teacher talk is worthless when it comes to learning. So of all that talking where they learn, of all that talking, the place where they actually learn is really small. They spend a lot of time talking about survival issues, right? How do we get this curriculum implemented before this date? How do we get these monitoring processes up and running? Who's going to teach this class? Oh my God, it's a Tuesday, I can't do that. But when teachers also talk about what's actually happening in their classrooms, that's where the rich opportunities for learning are. And so Ilana Horn has done a lot of different studies. This one is just one of many. I've also been studying in kindergarten teachers, secondary teachers, and higher education teachers. Across the board, we're finding the same thing. It's when teachers think ahead together. How are we actually going to do that? What's that going to look like? And or that's a preview, or when they reflect and actually walk through step by step, yeah, but then this thing happened, and some guided reflection, review a lesson, or when they say, yeah, what could I have done differently? Those are the moments where teachers learn, and they learn from each other usually because they ask those kinds of questions. How could I have done that differently? Or did you notice this thing happening over there? That's when that explication of expertise in relation to performance, those arrows I was talking about, happens. So one thing I wonder about is how open educational resources could be designed to encourage collegial talk. Janine Remillard at University of Pennsylvania basically says that she thinks curriculum materials should not be complete without teachers' input. And I wonder if somehow teachers' collegial input should be on that list. I don't know. What we have done at the University of Twente in this regard is we have looked at, the university decided that they had wanted to have a big new approach to education and teaching, and like every other project, like my ODS project, this one had a lot of failures, but they did one thing I think that was really smart, and that was they said to the teachers, you decide. We give you a couple of ingredients, and within a very broad framework, you decide what you're going to do. We're going to facilitate you working in teams. And I have we have two PhD students who've been studying what the teams have produced, the learner outcomes from that, but also how the teachers have grown from their interactions. And it's very promising. So if you want to know more about that, I'm happy to tell you. Last one. Is the issue of teaching, the scholarship of teaching as something that we might want to aspire to versus the fact that for many of us, teaching's an add-on duty, or hey, I didn't really sign up for the field of education. So that can be a bit of a tension. And then if you look at the reward systems in which most of us function, a lot of times it feels like you're being asked to live in two worlds. Be a really good teacher and do all these things, but we're not going to give you any credit for it. No promotion and tenure if you don't do these things. But the way that universities show how they value things sometimes could be more productive. We can work to change that, and like the senior teaching qualification is an example of how we're trying really hard at our university to change that. Meanwhile, life goes on, and you need to do something today. So I'm wondering about how open educational resources can support teachers in inquiry into their own practice. And I'm talking about the kind of inquiry that's publishable, right? So I'm at a technical university, so it counts for our guys to publish in the Journal of Engineering Education. And in thinking about how we do that, especially with my junior staff, I've been spending a lot of time lately trying to work out ways that final assignment papers, so like we have capstone projects and master's theses and things like that, how can we shape the work that we have to mentor anyway, the stuff that we're doing anyway with our students? How can we shape those kinds of assignments in ways that they stack together nicely and work to build a coherent whole research line for the coordinator teacher, and at the same time allow students enough autonomy and give them enough responsibility for coloring their own blocks and putting them, maybe even positioning them in a bigger space. So that's something that I think is a possibility. And some people do it, but it seems to me to be the exception rather than the rule. Yeah. So I had a couple basic ideas about curriculum that I wanted to share with you and a couple of examples. I know it was kind of quick, but we still have a little time for conversation. So if you want to talk about any of those things or something completely different, let's do it.
Thank you a lot, dear Suzanne. So we have time for some questions.
Thank you very much. The comment that you made about the fact that a lot of higher education educators don't really want to be educators is something that I think is really important. But the thing I wanted to ask was about your Lego picture that you just put up there, and this notion of having students work towards something that's useful for you as well. And everybody in here works in different national contexts, but there's ethical questions about whether or not your students are there to support you or you're there to support them. So is this something that, is there an international solution to this, or does everybody have to work in their own national context when they're dealing with those questions?
I don't know, but I don't know if there's an well, I guess if you're not careful, there could be an ethical issue. But I can give you a couple of examples from experience. Before I started working Lego-like, I would just, students would come in and they'd have this idea for a thesis topic, and I would try to accommodate every question that they had. I felt like I was falling short as a mentor because the one would be out in KLM looking at training routines, and another one would be in a classroom. And the variety was so huge that every time I had to become a mini expert, and I wasn't helping them as much. At the same time, I couldn't give them much guidance because I didn't know the context in which they were working. So that was a struggle from the teacher side. And from the student side, they had to, well, what was good was that they had to be very, very independent. Now, it's not that different. They still come to me when they've gone and met somebody from some other interesting place, and they come up with their own context and a lot of their own questions. But I simply say to them, the line of inquiry here, it's got to be like, for example, this is broad. It has to have something to do with the nexus of curriculum development and teacher professional learning. Can you fit it anywhere in there? So the tightness of the box, at least in my case, is minimal. But it allows me to stack things up in ways that I otherwise wouldn't. I do have a couple of projects, like with some PhD students, where we have big multi-country funded projects, and then basically they apply for the position. So it's sort of like a take it or leave it kind of thing. So I'm not sure if that addresses the kind of ethical consideration you were talking about, but it has them. I think most of them would say that they feel much more like they're part of a team than that they're on their own, and not like they're serving my needs. And I did put it that way because I wanted to show how it's part of living in academia, but I don't think that anybody feels like they're being used.
So I had a question, Susan, and I tweeted it, and it was one of your last slides about the scholarship of learning. And one of the things you prior heard us talk about was also being very interested in that. I don't know if this can contribute that, but also having the Daria Teach platform be, if I can use that word, described as something like a journal where contributions are peer-reviewed and published, if we can use those words. I don't know if things like that? Or are there other initiatives like that to raise what we do as teachers into that space of scholarship that seems to be, that is so valued?
So, well, I think thank you, that's a fun one. I think it depends on what you would say would count as scholarship. For several years, I led an international organization called the International Society for Design and Development and Education. Basically, it was anybody who designed stuff for education. And in that capacity, I can assure you I'm really fond of designs. Really, really fond of designs. But just showing our designs is typically not enough. And so the thing that Lee Shulman especially talks about when he talks about the scholarship of teaching is sort of a meta-level awareness of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and being able to have that conversation is a really essential part of scholarship. So whether you want to talk about your teaching, your pedagogical design, your material design, whatever, sharing the design is like, that's what we can encourage our beginners to do. But if you want to be a senior scholar then you need to be able to talk about it, to frame it, and to like annotate it.
So does that mean that if one way to look at it is it's not just enough, as you're saying, to create the course, but there needs to be something that's self-reflective alongside it that
well, there's self-reflection would also be one thing, but being able to say, I review for a lot of journals. Kind of
like an article.
Yeah, well, like in an article, when we present designs, for example, the designs themselves are very interesting, but to make it accessible and to make the knowledge that's embodied in the designs usable by others, you got to point out to people, like, notice this, and here's an instantiation of that. So it's more than personal reflection. It's being able to, say what's going on in the design.
Yeah. So kind of like, maybe I used the wrong word, but kind of like an article attached to the, maybe not 20 pages attached to the course that explains those kinds of things.
Yeah, or maybe even an overlay, right? Like, so you've got regular user view, and then you've got like learner view, and then you've got teacher view, where then there's an overlay that says, see this thing that's happening over here on this piece of the page, this is one of those. And the reason why we chose to do this, well, here's a link to 3 articles that'll tell you all about Pierre Dillenburg's orchestration work, right? Or whatever it is that you're trying to support.
Last questions, or everything is clear?
No?
Yes. While you talked about the many skills of that the teachers should learn, you briefly mentioned crafting activities. Could you explain what you mean by that, or what you have in mind?
Sure. So the actual interactions that are going to lead to learning, and they can be more human to human, they can be peer to peer, they can be learner to teacher, they can be person to artifact. So we get out in a group and we put some post-it notes over on that board, and then we come together and we talk about it, but thinking up all of those kinds of things. And an important part for teachers is usually to develop a kind of a pedagogical repertoire, right? So in my classes, I don't even think about it, but I know I fall back on the same kinds of discourse routines. And so and in some classes, they get tired of some of them. They know that when I say, all right, it's time to do think, pair, share, it means that for 5 minutes they're going to think and they're going to write something down, they're going to talk to a buddy, and after that we'll talk about it with the group. So by activities, and there probably is a better word for that, I mean all of those kinds of designs, from the teeny tiny, like think, pair, share, to the discourse routines where we get used to asking certain kinds of questions and stuff like that.
So, because I was wondering if you were talking more specifically about designing artifacts?
Well, and artifacts can sometimes support certain activities, and a lot of times teachers enjoy doing that. When I was a preschool teacher, I was always making stuff for the classroom, and I thought it was really weird that not everybody else was. But preschool teachers more than in primary school, and even more in primary school than in secondary school. And one of them actually said to me at one point, Susan, not everybody likes doing that stuff. And so being able to design is an important thing, but by and large, a lot of teachers really get more pleasure out of curating, out of picking just the right pieces from your wonderful resources that you have to share, for example, and of figuring out how to use just the right ingredients that are already out there. So designing, yes, for some. Curating for almost everybody, and something else that a lot of people do is redesign where was he now from Maynooth? I don't know where he went. The 1916 teachers, they had a couple of ideas that were very different from what the designers intended, but they were interesting and useful.